Welcome to Starting. I'm Deb. This week I'm going to talk a little bit about standing up on climate action. The written form of my blog is available in the link below, but I'll just share some of the thoughts as they sort of come as I look down the blog. I tend to write first and then record these videos so that I have sort of my thinking organized. I really wanted to share this week around standing up. For me, it brought up ideas that I'd experienced when my son was bullied when he was a child. So I'm going to share a little bit about this idea and how it connects to the concerns that I have around folks standing up, bystanding, and being targets in climate actions and in climate communications more generally. So basically, standing up is really hard to do. It often puts folks in a space where they're in conflict with others in their family, in their communities, in work. And so as we think about standing up around climate, we really need to understand that the ability to speak in community, to have civil discourse about climate action is critical to us as a society. And we'll dive into that more in this blog generally. But really, we want to make sure that we open spaces for communication. So I have noticed that there's been increased bullying in all different political strands for many years now. And I've really been trying to think about how do we foster civil conversation, debate in one way, but not really just conversation. Like I don't want it to be a win-lose situation. That's not actually helpful in this situation. I really want to think about how do we foster really good conversations. So to be able to kind of put that in perspective, I need us to get away from this bullying situation that I see a lot in social media, and I see it a lot in just environments that I work in or that I, am communicating with others in. So we need to think about starting with issues that we care about, right? We're all human and we have family and loved ones and places that we care about, and we need to start with those places. I'll start with a little story about my son. When he was very young, he was in grade 2, grade 3 is when it started happening. We became aware of it, I think, when he was in grade 3. He was being bullied by quite an organized group of bullies at school who were isolating him from his peers. And, he didn't think that this was a huge problem. He was a little bit sad that other kids didn't want to play with him. But there were real consequences starting to emerge in how he was feeling about just school life. Like he was happy at home and really well-adjusted kid, had good friends in out-of-school context. But his friends from school weren't visiting him anymore, and there was just this weird situation. So we'd, ask the questions you do at dinner table, and eventually it came out that this was going on and had been going on for a significant period of time. So we dove into it with him and really worked with him to teach him skills to stand up to bullies, to push back in respectful and appropriate ways, to speak out, and just not to allow that to happen. We also worked with the school, our family, our other child, to really learn those lessons ourselves and how to work and figure that out. My son is a member of the military now, and I'm deeply proud of him, both my children, and really thinking about how neither one of them will really allow people to be bullied in any way. They stand up and defend people. So let's talk a little bit about the bullying triangle. So the bullying triangle involves 3 different groups. It involves bullies, targets, and bystanders. So we're very familiar usually with the bullies and targets, but we're not as often familiar with the bystanders. We don't usually focus on the bystanders. And in terms of climate, I really want to talk about the bystanders. So every type of bystander has choices. Bystanding is not neutral ground. You're either aligning yourself with the bully or you're aligning yourself with the target. And it depends on your action, okay? Inaction is action. There is no neutral ground in this situation. So when we're thinking about the bullying triangle, we have to think that our individual actions are connected to our collective values as a community. So what do we want to see? Is the bullying behavior something we're okay with, or is it something that we're not okay with? And we actually want to have an environment where the the target has room to speak, freedom of expression, which we'll get into in the next blog. So with bystanding, I carried some of these lessons from my son when I actually had to dive into like what was bullying. I carried some of those lessons forward to other places in my life, and really think a lot about where different folks are experiencing violence, different forms of violence. Silence can be a form of violence when people won't stand up for others. And so I really want to talk about that with respect to climate change. So in the past few decades, the impacts of climate change has become much more obvious to folks in all parts of the world. I'll add some resources into the blog around this. And when we see more and more people choosing to stand up in these spaces and speak to this, often those people get bullied in different ways. They get like identity politics start to come into play. And that is not healthy for us as a community, as a society, as a global society. That is not healthy. We need to be able to share ideas, critique the ideas, but not totally trash people. That is not helpful. All right. So what is civil debate and what are the options that we have in growing that? One of the things that I would love us to think about in terms of climate and civil debate is let's think about how we talk about climate, right? If people are trying to just shut us down when we talk about climate, that's a bullying behavior, all right? We shouldn't ever shut down civil conversation. There may be times where it's not appropriate to have, and we can say, let's move that to another time. But just totally shutting it down, not helpful, okay? I have added some resources to the blog about talking about climate at different ages. It's not always appropriate to talk all the details of economic policies and global, biogeochemistry issues with kindergartners. Okay. So what are the right sort of ways that we speak about climate to different folks, and how can we find the shared ground that we can then build more common understandings around? We also have to understand there's mental health impacts of climate inaction. So I've shared some resources from the Climate Mental Health Network and others around like what is it when we actually do nothing and we just let the feelings of anxiety or despair or distress sort of percolate in us. Maybe not us individually, but maybe us collectively as a society. That is not a good move either. And then also when we start to think about climate change, often people go to like global cycling immediately. Okay, I'd love it if everybody had a basic understanding of global chemistry, global energy budgets. That would be awesome. And I'll provide some resources as we go along on this starting project to really think about that. But honestly, the best place to start is, again, start with what you care about. So look at issues that matter to you. Agriculture, local economic issues, fisheries. I live in a coastal region, forest health and wellness. Like, think about the issues that are going to be important to you locally, and your family, and think about how they connect to climate. We also might want to think about how the different roles we have in life, right? So we have roles as family members, we have roles in our work lives. We may be elected officials or supervisors or influencers, thought leaders, corporate executives, all of these different kinds of roles, spiritual guides. All of those roles, they have leadership in them, right? Many of us are leaders in different aspects of our lives. So we also need to actually learn a little bit about what good leadership looks like, because we don't always have those examples and mentors around us. So I've included some resources in the blog around like what are good leaders, right? And the idea that authentic and empathetic, that's a hard one to say, empathy is actually really great characteristics of good leaders. Those people that we are drawn to as leaders are often very honest people who are in tuned with those emotions and feelings that we have in the world, the things that we care about. So we have to ask ourselves, how are we showing up in these ways? And how do we grow good leadership in our networks? How do we help support leaders and foster them in different ways? So there's a bunch of different resources around that. And in our own families, we have to think that sometimes it's really difficult. We have families with really different political beliefs. I do. And so, how do we help talk in those situations in ways that are not going to harm our personal relationships necessarily? They might make it a little more tense sometimes when we bring these topics up, but how do we work through that? And so I'm going to lean into some resources by the amazing Dr. Catherine Hayhoe here to really think about, like, what does it look like to talk with family who are different than us. Again, just thinking about that civil discourse. So I provided some resources around civil discourse too, thinking about, how do we get down to, like, what do we really value and care about? In the future, I'll share a little bit about something called the Talanoa Dialogues. How do we dream forward so that we come back to shared values? Because often when we get down to it, many of us do care about the future. We do care about our children. We care about the environment. We care about the health of humans and the planet. But we have different ideas about how to get there, about what's important. We feel stressed about our economics. And I'll provide some of that background and research as we sort of go along, just to resource and help us learn together. So a few questions that we might want to ask ourselves as we dive into different resources. There are some cool resources that you might want to start just reading on that I've provided. And they come from a range of different political stances. So just dive in and explore, have an open mind and, like, think about what is it that we can do as we're really starting to bridge, like, grow connections across spaces. So a couple questions that you might want to, like, start asking yourself as you consider if you even want to get into climate action, if you want to, like, why is it your concern? How can we lean into our democratic principles and listen to and learn from each other? That's a question that guides much of my work. I don't want to speak in an echo chamber. I don't want to listen in an echo chamber. I want to learn from people with really diverse experiences and lived realities. And I have grown so much in my own understanding about what's possible because of that. How do we decide who to trust and how to hold them accountable to that trust? We actually learn. Most of us learn from trusted messengers. So why do we trust them? Is that trust well placed? Are they accountable to continuing to be trustworthy? Those are all questions that we can explore here. And then how do we begin to understand the complex and intersecting issue of scientific reliability, climate change, climate justice? I am not going to shy away from the word justice, but I'm going to complicate it for everyone. And climate action in ways that matter to our everyday lives, okay? These things all are entwined, which sometimes is why we get so messed up when we're starting to talk and think about climate change and climate action. And then why should we care about all this? Is it really our work individually? Is it our work collectively? That's a question we're going to struggle with too. So hopefully you'll come along on these conversations with me and just dive in to starting, okay? Because at the core of this is, how do I, as an individual, start taking climate action? And that's the question that I'm organizing this series of blogs and videos and everything around. I am so sick, as many people are, of playing the identity politics, the bullying of everyday folks or of scientists or of political leaders. Like, I just do not want to enter that fray. I want to be able to speak community to community, person to person, in real ways, with evidence about what is it that we know, what do we care about, what do we understand, and and how do we figure out how to move forward? Because I see a lot of stress and anger and worry in the world, and I also see a lot of ways through that. Okay, ways through that in community with each other, to be able to find ways forward. I'm choosing not to be a bystander, but instead to stand up for climate action, and I'm hoping that you will too.